In case some of you are wondering, that's not Josh Allen, the football player that was baptized here. Been kind of cool, but that's not who that was. But anyway, welcome. Glad you're here. Thanks for being part of the journey on this Sunday morning. Especially Commanders fans, there's a football game that starts here in 10 minutes, and you were here, so that tells us what you think about the season, right? And to those of you online, I'm sure some of you are going to be paying attention to me and not the football game for the next few moments. But really are glad that you're here this morning. A lot of us are in neighborhood groups. About 60% of our adults here at The Journey are in a neighborhood group, which is pretty amazing. One of the things that we do before our group gets started, maybe you guys do this too, are highs and lows, right? Or someone in our group likes to call it our happies and crappies. It's kind of a look back at the week. Here are the things that we were celebrating this past week. Here are the challenges that we had in this past week. A couple of weeks ago, I was sharing with our group my highs and lows. And I said my high is I just purchased tickets for our family to fly out to Oregon the week after Christmas to go spend it with our daughter, our son-in-law, and our grandson. I said my low for the past week was purchasing tickets to fly out to Oregon the week after Christmas to, go see our family members. It's not cheap to fly 4 people from the East Coast to the West Coast and back. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. But that's part of the planning process, right? You buy tickets when you go on vacation. You get a place to stay. You got to figure out what you're going to do while you're there. Get a rental car. Where you're going to eat. I mean, you got to put all of these plans together when you do something like take a vacation. But we take and make plans all the time. That's just a part of our life. Even if we're not good at planning, like our life is full of planning. We plan the meals that we're going to have. We plan work projects. We plan our finances. We plan weddings. I mean, planning is a part of who we are. And today, as we continue our series in the book of James, we're going to talk about planning. Because James talks about planning, but he talks about it in such a way, he says, hey, sometimes we forget the most important part of planning, and that's putting God into the plans we make. And so this morning, we're going to spend our time in James chapter 4. James chapter 4, if you've got a Bible, you can turn there. We're going to put it up here on the screen. It's verses 13 through 17. I'm actually going to go ahead and read that whole passage, and then I'm going to come back and kind of break it down a little bit. But here's what James writes in James 4. Look here, you who say today or tomorrow we are going to a certain town and we'll stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, and then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. Remember, it is a sin to know what you ought to do, and then not to do it. Before we kind of dive into this, I want to remind us about the audience that James is writing to. We call this a book in the New Testament. It's actually a letter that James writes. He writes it to Jewish Christians. This is a group of people who grew up Jewish. Jesus comes along. He's the Messiah, and so they start to follow Jesus. And so now they are these Jewish Christians. The Jewish religious leaders are upset about this. They're saying Jesus isn't the Messiah. And so they begin to persecute these Jewish Christians. And so this persecution is taking place, so they have to get out of Jerusalem and the surrounding area. They scatter all over the Roman Empire. And so James is writing to these scattered Jewish Christians. Now, another thing that we've talked about in this series is that the majority of the people that James is writing to are poor. During the Roman Empire, about 62% of the people who lived in that empire lived within the poverty line or less. I mean, they were extremely poor. And so much of what we read here in the book of James is actually connected to the poor Jewish Christians. But there's another group of people that James is writing to. And so as we read this passage right here, we can kind of see that he's talking maybe to another group. This other group he's talking to, probably more like middle class type that we would categorize it as. But these were entrepreneurs. They were merchants. They were business owners. And so what do you do when you own a business? Well, in those days, you would do trade. And so you would travel all over the place to set up a shop, maybe to negotiate some prices, to maybe start a franchise, whatever it may be, because you were doing everything you could to make money. And so James, in these verses here, is talking to that particular group of people. Now, as we read this, it sounds like he's condemning business. He's actually not. What he's doing is he's confronting a mindset. Before I came into ministry, I worked in the insurance industry for 4 years. And one day I went out to eat lunch with a businessman I knew who was very successful. And I just wanted to kind of learn from him, like, hey, how did you get to this place? And in the midst of our conversation, he hands me this book right here. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. He said, Chad, if you read this book, it'll change your mindset about yourself, about life, and about business. I read about 3 chapters and I was good to go at that point, right? I was done with that book, and maybe some of you have actually read through the whole thing. But if you're familiar with this book, Napoleon Hill, it's kind of his idea is your thoughts have the power to create your reality. Like you are the one who controls your life. You control your future, and it's all about having this particular mindset. James is actually confronting that mindset. The one that says, I control my life. I control the trajectory of my future. I decide what happens next. And so here's James in this passage who says, hey, some of you are making plans, right? You're making plans for the future. You're making plans of where to go and when to go and how long you're going to be there. And here's James is saying, you've got this incredible confidence in who you think you are, in the abilities that you think you have. But there's a danger in this if you're a follower of Jesus. Well, how do we know this? Well, let's keep looking through James, because James talks about these issues and dangers that are there. Look at verse 14. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. James actually brings 2 really powerful statements in a few short words here in verse 14. The first thing that we see that James talks about, he says, you have no idea what your future holds. Wouldn't it be great if we knew the future? One of my favorite movies is this one from 2002, Minority Report. Maybe some of you have seen that movie before and enjoyed it as much as I did. It's actually about the police department in Washington, D.C. They had a pre-crime unit, and the pre-crime unit worked with these pre-cogs. These were 3 individuals who could predict the future, and they could predict the future when it came to committing crimes. And so they could predict who was going to commit the crime, where they were going to do it, how they were going to do it, what time they were going to do it. I mean, everything you could ask about a crime, they would know it. They would foretell the future, right? Predict the future. That information would go to the D.C. Police Department, the pre-crime division, and then they would go out and arrest the person before they actually committed the crime, okay? The crime was coming. It hadn't happened yet, but they would go out and arrest that person, which, if you know the movie, meant that crime was about 0% in Washington, D.C. It'd be amazing if we could predict the future like that. Probably be even more amazing if we could predict our own future. The college you were going to go to, the person you were going to marry, the job you were going to have, the income that you were going to bring in, where you were going to live, your retirement, when Jesus was coming back, which some people tried to do not too long ago, and that didn't go too well for them, right? But there's this idea that for you and I, we desire certainty so badly that we will try to manufacture it ourselves. Like we want to know the future. We think we're prophets. We think we're future tellers. We think, hey, this is the plans I have for me for the future. Here are the goals that I have. Here's the direction I want to go in my life. And we think that's exactly what's going to happen. But things happen. Things change, don't they? There's a job change. There's a furlough that takes place. Maybe for some, there's a diagnosis that comes in, or a relationship shifts, or just life happens. We plan for the future, acting like we know the future and what the future is going to hold for us, but then what actually happens is different than our plans. And James reminds the audience that he's writing to, he reminds us in this moment that we can't predict the future. But there's another piece to this, right? James says, you are more fragile than you think. I realize this is true the older I get. Because I don't know about you, my mind says you are still 20 years old. My body says you're nowhere close to that, right? And so what do we do? When your mind says you're 20 years old, you'll go out and play some sport you haven't played in 15, 20 years. You'll say, hey, I'm going to go out for a 20-mile jog, and you haven't done that for like 5 years. Or I'm going to go ride my bike for 25 miles, and you haven't ridden your bike since you were a little kid. But we go do it because our mind's like, hey, you got this. Like, nobody can stop you. You're still 20 years old. And then you go out and do those things, and maybe during the midst of this activity you're doing, you pop a hamstring. Or maybe a little bit later on in the day, you're like, oh, that doesn't feel real good. Or what usually happens for me, the next day I'll wake up and like, I didn't know I had a muscle there, but I guess I do. Right? Our minds say, hey, you're 20 years old, but our bodies say, no, you're actually very, very fragile. That's what James is saying here. He's equating this fragility of our bodies, right? He says our lives are like morning fog. A better definition of this, a better translation of this is smoky vapor. It's like someone who smokes a cigar and takes a puff of it. You see the smoke and then you don't see it anymore. That's the same idea here that James is talking about. Like, we know our lives are short. We know that life is unpredictable, but we rarely plan like that is true. We plan like we will live forever. And so James says, you're trying to predict the future, and you don't actually have the ability to do that. And he says at the same time, you're acting like you're going to live forever, but your lives are fragile, they're frail, they come and go. And so he leads with these two really big statements right here. Now, we could read that and we could think to ourselves, well, he's talking about planning, like we shouldn't plan. That's not what he's saying at all. He's not against planning. Planning's good. Planning is healthy. Planning sets boundaries and limits. It gives us a direction for who we are personally or in our work world or family world, whatever it may be. Planning is good. In fact, planning is biblical. A couple times Jesus talks about how important planning is. We look at the book of Proverbs, and there's sayings in there that talk about the power of planning and what comes from the planning that we do. James isn't talking about, hey, don't plan. What James is saying is there's an issue when we plan without God. Look at verse 15. James says, what you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. We can be great visionaries, right? We can set amazing goals for ourselves, for families, for work, for churches, for organizations we lead. It's very easy to plan centered on ourselves, right? But that means many times we're self-centered in that planning. We are self-serving. We're self-glorifying in the plans that we make. Even when it comes to God. Think about our spiritual lives. Many times what we'll say is, hey, God, Sunday's your day. Or what we'll really say is, hey, God, Sunday for about an hour and a half is your day. Time I leave my house, time I go to church, time I come home. That's your time, God. But everything else after that on Sunday and everything from Monday to Saturday, hey, God, that's my time. And so I'm going to plan out my time. I'm going to chase my dreams. I'm going to chase after the things that I think are most important for me. I'm going to plan for my future. And God just really becomes this informational footnote in our lives and not someone who we engage with to help us guide our plans. But God doesn't ask for just Sundays. God asks for every part of every day that we live. And we struggle with engaging God in that. Now, why do we do that? I think Jesus put it best. I read this a few weeks back from a teaching Jesus gives in Matthew chapter 6. Jesus says, wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. We like to plan our lives without God. Why? Because that's where our heart is. Our heart is focused on our treasures. Our heart is focused on the things that we feel are most important to us. Again, whatever that may be for us, our own treasures, our own hopes and dreams. And we leave God out of the planning because my heart's not focused on what God's will is. It's focused on my will for myself. And so James says those words right there. If the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. He says that's what we ought to say. Now, actually a better translation of the very first part of that is if God wills it. This would have been very familiar to these Jewish Christians because it was actually a phrase that was used quite often in pre-Christian Greek philosophy and religion. But people would say it this way. They would say, if the gods will it. If the gods will it. Here's James, who uses that same phrase, but he makes it singular. James says, if God wills it. If God wills it, we will live and do this or that. Why is James making the singular for one, and why is he using that phrase? Well, he's challenging our self-sufficient ways. Where we say, I can do this. I'm the one that's in control of my life. I can set the trajectory, the future for my life. I can do this on my own. And yet James is like, no. We need to engage God in the plans that we have. We need to seek out God's wisdom and direction for the plans that we have in our minds. That our plans should be in the will of God and not my will only. Something has to keep us from doing that. What is it that keeps us from not engaging God in our plans? Well, James actually talks about it in that next verse. Verse 16, he says, otherwise you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. What does James say is keeping us from engaging God in our plans? And one thing, it's pride. Pride keeps us from engaging God into our lives. My pride says, I got here on my own. Nobody's helped me get here. I am in the place I am today because of the work that I put into this. I built this life. I know what's best. I don't need anyone to help me. I didn't need God to get me to this place. You know what? Living in a place like this, an area like we do right here, it's easy to rely on ourselves. Because many of us got here because of the skills that we have. We're experienced in what we do. We're highly educated. We're knowledgeable. We're hardworking. We're competent. I mean, that's why we have jobs in a place like this. But someone once said, your competence becomes your confidence. Your confidence becomes your independence. And your independence becomes your spiritual weakness. Sometimes that independence that we have and the confidence that comes with that, we're like, hey, I can do this on my own. And yet when it comes to who we are spiritually, that becomes a thing that makes us spiritually weak. And it becomes a thing we have to protect ourselves from. I love the way John puts it in 1 John. He writes these words. He says, do not love this world nor the things it offers you. For when you love the world, you do not have the love of the Father in you. For the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure, a craving for everything we see. Look at this next part. And pride in our achievements and possessions. These are not from the Father, but are from this world. And this world is fading away along with everything that people crave. But anyone who does what pleases God will live forever. My plans become about one person. They become about me. And it's me being in control of the things that James talks about there at the beginning, right? Where I go, what I do, how long I'm going to be there. I don't need God because I can do this on my own. And so my pride takes over my ability to trust God in helping me, in guiding me, and giving me direction in life. When we let our pride rule us, there are always going to be consequences to that. When our competence becomes our spiritual weakness, when our pride takes over, it leads us to making poor decisions in our life. How many people do you know that their marriage is over with because of pride? How many people do you know who've lost friendships because of pride? How many people do you know that no longer have a relationship with a parent or a child because of pride? Decisions were made in life that were there because of pride. And let's just be honest, maybe for some of us that are here right now, relationships that were important to us are over now because of pride. And that pride led us to these decisions that were outside of God's will. And in those moments, we knew that, but we made those decisions anyway because of the pride we have. And now there's this disconnect that we have with God. We're wondering what happened there. Well, we left God out of the planning of our life. We disregarded God's influence in our day-to-day lives. And so when we look at this passage here in James and what James is saying here, when he's talking about how our plans are evil, again, he's not saying planning is evil, right? He's saying it's the manner in which we plan. It's when we plan without God that can be evil. We believe we can control our own outcomes. Or maybe for some of us, we think if I invite God into my plans, then here's what's going to happen. God's going to get in the way. Because God's going to ask me to do something or want me to do something I don't want to do, and I don't have time for that. I've got my plans. I've got my goals. I got my strategy. I know where I'm going. I know how long this is going to take. And so sometimes we just leave God out because, hey, God, you're just going to mess my plans up. And James is like, no, why not let God be an integral part of your planning and life? Why don't you let God lead you in these outcomes that God wills for you? And too often it's because of the pride that we have. But thankfully, James gives us a solution. It's in a strange verse. It's verse 17 there. Let me read that to you. It says, remember, it is sin to know what you ought to do and then not to do it. Better translation there for remember is actually the word therefore. So when we read that, even though that verse seems a little bit off within this passage that we read from James, what James is really saying is, hey, I'm going to tell you this one piece, but I want you to understand that this piece here is really important. This part is actually connected to that paragraph that we just looked at. He's saying, don't forget this one thing. It's meant to be encouraging to the audience that's hearing these words from James, but it's also meant to be a challenge. And challenges them in maybe a way they haven't thought of before. Like if you fail to do what is right, then you're actually failing God too. You're not doing God's will. Again, you read that verse there, it's kind of a strange input that James is giving here. So what is he talking about? He's actually giving us a lesson on sin. And so let me just take a moment here and just kind of talk about that word sin. I think all of us are probably familiar with the term sin. But maybe we don't know that sin actually comes in two categories. The first category of sin is the sins of commission. This is where we blatantly act against God's will for our lives. We could set up here today, and I could put a whiteboard up here, and we could put hundreds, maybe thousands of different sins on here. We know sin, right? We know when we blatantly go against God's will. Lying and gossip and cheating and murder and hate and the addictions that we face. All those things are bad things. And again, we know bad things. We can define bad things. We can give examples of bad things. So that's those sins of commission. And then there are sins of omission. This is when we know the right things to do, and yet we don't do them. This is a sin that I believe we probably struggle with more than any other. Now, you're sitting there and you may be thinking, what are those? I don't quite understand this. Albert Barnes wrote a commentary on James. Here's what he said about this particular passage and talking about what James is talking about here in verse 17. He says, if he understands what his duty is, if he has the means of doing good to others, if by his name, his influence, his wealth, he can promote a good cause, if he can consistently with other duties relieve the distressed, the poor, the prisoner, the oppressed, if he can send the gospel to other lands or can wipe away the tear of the mourner, if he has talents by which he can lift the voice that shall be heard in favor of temperance, chastity, liberty, and religion, he is under obligations to do it. And if by indolence or avarice or selfishness or the dread of the loss of popularity, he does not do it, he is guilty of sin before God. What James is getting at here is following Jesus isn't just about not sinning. And yet, so often that's kind of what we think. Following Jesus is all about me not doing bad things. If I do bad things, then I am sinning. James is also saying, hey, when we don't do the right things, when those opportunities come our way, then it's no different than us doing the bad things. We are still sinning. Colton Mathers was a Puritan pastor and author back in the late 1600s and early 1700s, and he had something he called a principle of action. He defined it this way. He said, the ability to do good in any case imposes an obligation to do it. James says, if I am focused on my plans, my dreams, my calendar, my career, my goals, and I miss the opportunities to do good because I'm focused on me, James says that is a sin. And what he's saying here is remember that the God is at work in the world, and God gives us opportunities. Maybe some of us, we can say divine moments to encourage other people, to help other people, to support other people, to be present for other people, to lift other people up. That we have these incredible opportunities to do that. But when my plans are first, when I'm more focused on my own life and goals, I will oftentimes miss the opportunities that God places in front of me. I will oftentimes maybe even ignore the opportunities that God has placed in front of me. I'll walk past those needs. I won't see those needs. I may hear someone say, hey, I'm fine, when you ask how you doing. And I know they're not fine. And in that moment, I'm like, oh, that's good to hear. And I just keep on walking on past. This is what James is getting at here, that if we follow Jesus, when I'm avoiding those opportunities that are put in front of me to serve and help and to support other people, then I'm sinning. That what I need to do is I need to step into that goodness that God puts there in front of me and help others. That's that principle of action that Mathers is talking about here. Doing the right thing, because as a follower of Christ, I have an obligation to act or to help someone in need. And James says when we don't do that, because we're so focused on our plans for our life, what we're really doing is sinning against ourselves, we're sinning against other people, and we're sinning against God. So there's actually a lot there in those few verses that James shares with us. And so maybe what are some ways that we can live this out in our own lives? Well, let me share with you just two thoughts that I pulled from this passage that I believe can help us in our world today. The first thing I would say is we invite God to engage in our plans. Now, sometimes when it comes to inviting God to engage in our plans, here's how this works. We will make all of our plans, all of our goals, set everything up, and then the next thing we will say is, hey, God, how about you just kind of bless this work I've done? That's not what we're talking about, okay? What we're talking about here is we invite God first into the plans that we have. We engage with God. We invite God to engage in our plans. How's the best way to do this? Well, I think the best principle of action we can take, based on what Matthew said a little bit earlier, is through the act of prayer. And some of you are like, oh, I came here for you just to tell us that we need to pray more. As someone said this week, I was reading through my message, give me some feedback. They were like, it feels like we just kind of say these church answers a lot. And I said, well, if people actually did them and took them seriously, then we won't have to talk about it anymore, right? Because I think this is a challenge for us. I know this is a challenge for me. It's very easy for me to sit down and say, I'm going to make all these plans. And at the end, like, oh, yeah, I probably should invite God into this. That's not the way this should work. We should invite God into our plans from the very beginning. That God shouldn't be some afterthought to the planning that we are doing. But God should be there at the beginning. And God should be in the midst. And God should be there at the end of our plans. And the best way to do that is to invite God through prayer. Okay? Now let me add a couple of pieces of this that maybe will help make this a little bit more than just some church answer that you may be hearing. The first thing I would say, the reason we're praying here is to make sure we're in God's will. Okay? And so maybe one of the things that we can do is a few weeks ago I talked about praying the day. Where you look at your calendar and at the beginning of the day, you just pray through all the things you've got on your calendar that day. Hey, God, be there for this meeting, this phone call, whatever it may be. Maybe another piece of this is that we have plans or goals or ideas or things that we've been thinking about that we want to see come to fruition. And so as we're praying through the day of our schedule, we're throwing this in as a part of our prayer time too. Right, at the beginning of the day, God, I got this meeting, this going on. Oh, God, by the way, I got this big project that's getting ready to start at work. Hey, be in the midst of this. Lead me, guide me. It doesn't have to be long. You don't have to go through details. God probably pretty much already knows what's going to happen. But you're just inviting God into those plans and projects and goals that you have as your day begins. And so pray and ask God every single day, just be in my planning. But how do we know we're in God's will as we're praying these prayers? I found this has been a huge help to me. Grab a small journal or even your phone if you want to use that. And then as you're planning, setting goals, thinking about the future, as you're asking God into this, write those goals out. Write those decisions out that you've got to make in that journal or, again, on your phone. And then every day as you're praying for that, if something happens that day and you're like, oh, man, I had this conversation and, this is what I'm thinking about. This is a goal I have, and that kind of fits with what I'm praying about. Just write down what you experienced. Write down what you heard. Write down what you saw or read, whatever it may be. Maybe you even heard something from God. And as you go through your week, just kind of go back and look at, I believe, how God is working. I know I've done this many, many times where I have gone back and I've taken had a journal and just written out these ideas, these goals, future moves for our family, and said, all right, God, where are you in this? And just watching God at work and saying, okay, that's a no over there, that's a yes over there, that's a maybe or a wait or whatever it may be. It's such a powerful way for us to see God at work. Doesn't mean God's going to give you an answer in a week, okay? It may be years down the road, but you're able to kind of follow it along and see how you are living in God's will through something so simple as journaling through those ideas and goals and plans for your life. You're inviting God into that. One other thing I would throw here is find a follower of Jesus, someone you know that you trust, and invite them into this too. Like, hey, here's what I'm praying about. This is what's important to me. I trust you, your faith. I just want you to give me feedback. If you hear God speaking to you or something comes to you, you want to share with me, please do. I mean, I believe there are multiple ways that we can figure out God's will for our lives and living in God's will. But the first thing we have to do is engage and invite God into our plans. Second thing I would say, though, based on what we just read here in James, is join God in his work in the world. Some of you may have read Henry Blackaby's book, Experiencing God, or gone through that workbook. I think it's been around for 30, 40 years. I know people have done it. It's been life-changing for them. But in this book, he writes these words. He says, see where God is working in your world and join him in that work. Like living our life is not just about our plans and trying to reach our goals and reach some sort of future. It's also making sure that we are part of what God is doing in our world today. Which means if we are open to that, right? And not only are we praying about our own plans, but we're saying, hey, God, where you work, where can I help you out as you do this amazing stuff that we see in the world around us? What can I do for you? It means God's Spirit's going to interrupt your schedule. And God's Spirit is not going to fit into the calendar that you've already got set up. And God's Spirit is going to interrupt your plans. But maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need to be interrupted by God's Spirit in our lives so that we can do good, so that we can do right things in this world. And when we're already opened up to what God is doing in our life, as we ask God for direction and guidance, God's going to say, hey, here's this moment I want you to jump in and help this person, encourage this person, support this person. That when they say, hey, I'm fine, and you look at them and you're like, you ain't fine, right? I hear what you're saying, but I'm bringing you to dinner tonight. I hear what you're saying, but I'm going to watch your kids one night this week. I hear what you're saying, but I'm going to be there for you in that tough time. I hear what you're saying, but I'm just going to sit with you as you mourn, as you grieve. Sometimes we need to ask God, hey, God, not only come into my plans for my life as I try to live your will out, but God, I want to live out your will in the world. I want to work with you in the work that you are doing here on earth. Let's not miss the opportunities that are in front of us because we're so worried about our own plans. We can't predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. Our lives are fragile. We're here today. We're gone tomorrow. We can invite God to be in our plans as we tell God, hey, I'm here to do whatever you need to do good in the world today. A great example of this actually goes back to Cotton Mather's. Back in 1721, there was a smallpox outbreak in Boston where he lived. And at that point in time, 800 people had died, about 14% of the population. And of course, people were afraid and worried. One day, Mathers is talking to one of the enslaved people that worked for him, a man named Onesimus. And Onesimus was from a West African village. And so Mathers asked him, he's like, hey, have you ever had smallpox? And he's like, no. And it's because I was inoculated from it when I lived in Africa. And so this kind of got Mathers' attention. He's like, what are you talking about? So Onesimus began to explain everything that had happened and how the procedure and how this worked and how so few people there were dying of smallpox because of this. Mathers in that moment had a decision to make, right? Do I just dismiss this information because I've got a church to run and I've got a family to take care of and I got other things I need to do in my life because I've got plans for myself? Or do I see this as an opportunity as God speaking to me? He chose the latter. And he began to share this information with people he knew, which actually made death threats, bomb threats come to him and his family, because many people thought this is just some voodoo medicine from West Africa. And he was like, I'm not giving up on this. I believe there's something here. And finally, one of the doctors there in town in the city of Boston heard him, listened to him, tried it out, tested it, and it worked. Mortality rate dropped from 14% to 3% there in Boston. But not only did it save many people's lives there, it also led to influencing Edward Jenner as he came up with the 1796 smallpox vaccine. Are we all about our plans? Is it all about my life and my goals and the things that I'm looking forward to the future? Or am I inviting God into his work here in this world that aren't just for my plans, but what God is doing here? God's not looking for control. God just wants us to put our trust fully in him. And when we have our trust in him, God will guide our plans as we live our lives and follow the way God is leading us to help and support others.